Kohoʻia is when the Kuleana chooses you. You have this job opportunity, and so on the surface, you believe that you have a choice to make. Kohoʻia, underneath the surface, the decision has already been made. Mālama kuʻuhome, or caring for my beloved home. There was a mantra that evolved for me and became a source document presented to the selection committee. When I started to raise the question about why am I doing this, it actually had less to do with tourism and more to do with caring for a place I love, my home, Hawaii. Tourism was an instrument that, when applied correctly, could help elevate the quality of life. There's this half glass of water, and I'm looking at the glass, and I can hear my grandmother. She's talking about the water. First was, the question about whether it's half full or half empty is the wrong question. The glass has always been 100% filled. The air we breathe, our ancestors referred to as Ha, the breath of life. That part which we drink, Wai, fresh water, the fresh waters of life. And E is in reference to the spiritual dimension represented by the light. What I typically don't share is that she had passed away roughly 6 months before that. What did Grandma say all the time? Clean your own house first. You're not here to tell other people that they gotta clean their house. So when I think of it, this idea of coming home, home being within, basically clean my own stuff. It's time to be more mindful, more introspective, more forgiving too of whatever mistakes may have been made.
Greater Good Radio, connect, learn, heal, and grow is brought to you by Brain Gain Hawaii, a boutique executive recruiting, career development, and coaching firm. Learn more at braingainhi.com. Welcome to Greater Good Radio. Today we're here with John DeFries, former president and CEO of HTA.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. So how would you kind of introduce yourself now?
I'm a descendant of Waikiki. I live in Kona, so I'm oriented to kind of the physical spaces that I'm in. Just finished 3 years at the Hawaii Tourism Authority and intend on taking some time off, more for introspection and relaxation, but also extremely grateful for the 3 years that I had at HTA.
Wait, so how old are you now?
I just turned 72 in July. Class of 1969 at Punahou, and happy to be at 72.
Yeah. At 72, what makes you still want to keep working?
It's my nature, first of all. Secondly, there's no shortage of needs that Hawaii has, right? For all the good that we have, we've evolved kind of an economic system that appears to be putting quality of life out of reach for the generations behind me, right? And, I don't have illusions of doing sweeping change in the time I'm here as much as I have a lot of confidence in the 2 generations behind me and some of the talent that I've been able to work with. Whatever time I have left, if I can help position that, whether it be in tourism or other aspects of our economy, I'm intent on doing it. So I'll take some time off and reflect. And, I learned a term back in 2001 called Kohoʻia. It's a Hawaiian term, Kohoʻia. Kohoʻia is when the Kuleana chooses you. I felt that way about competing for the job at Tourism Authority. Tourism as an industry has been the college I never went to, right? And so I'm very protective of it. It's like my alma mater. And when that job was open in the summer of 2020, at that point we were 100 days into COVID, right? So we were at risk from a public health standpoint, and visitor arrivals dropped in July of 2020 to about 0, right? So now economically we were in collapse. Right? And frankly, we didn't know where the floor of that collapse was at that time. And, I live in Kona. My daily patterns are built around residing in Kona. And choosing to compete for an executive position in Honolulu meant that my life, my wife, our lives would be in an upheaval. But we're not raising children of our own, right? So when we finally sat down and talked about it in depth, we realized that we were basically as flexible and free as a 35-year-old, right? And she encouraged me to go for it. And we did. That whole process was cathartic in many ways, right? At that time, there were like 324 applicants for it. It was cathartic for me in the sense that I had to understand, I knew what I could do. What I had to come to grips with is, why am I doing it, right?
Yeah.
Why at this stage would you go do that? Right? In fact, in the weeks leading up to my decision to go compete, I had actually talked to 2 candidates, next generation type, right? And to encourage them to become candidates. I thought they had the game to do it. And then I went back to Kona and I started getting phone calls and text messages from people encouraging me to consider it. And what struck me was the diversity of the people who were calling and reaching out, right? I would expect industry professionals that I had worked with, former elected officials, right? What I didn't expect was leaders in the nonprofit arena, Native Hawaiian groups, right? And again, we're now in the introductory weeks of COVID. And so for me, ultimately, there was a mantra that evolved for me and became a source document presented to the selection committee, and it was called Mālama Kuʻohome, or Caring for My Beloved Home. When I started to raise the question about why am I doing this, it actually had less to do with tourism and more to do with caring for a place I love, right? My home, Hawaii. And recognizing that tourism was an instrument that, when applied correctly, could help elevate the quality of life, right? Restore the economy. And so Mālama Kuʻohome became kind of the internal guiding principle during the time at HTA. It's also a very personal. John DeFries cannot tell you how to take care of your home, right? At some point, we have the capacity to understand that within ourselves. And every day there are acts of Mālama that are taking place in every sector of our community. And, we saw great examples of that type of response during COVID, and we're clearly seeing it now with the tragic events on Maui, right? So for all those reasons, I'm grateful.
Kohoʻia, can you tell us the origin of that?
2001, I am contemplating taking a position as CEO of a major land development in South Kona. And at the time, very controversial. It was in court, front page of the Kona newspaper every week. And the owners, who were out of Japan and Arizona and a bank in Scotland, were in a predicament and had recruited me and made this job offer. I sought the advice of a woman that I have tremendous respect for. They call her Auntie Pua, Dr. Pualani Kanakaole Kanahele, who's been a dear friend for a while. And I told her that this decision to make about taking on this substantial work, 1,500 acres of land, probably at that time 400 staff people and another 400 contractors. And it was clearly a scope of work that was beyond anything I'd done. But what I never talked about back then publicly was that in the course of doing some initial consulting work for the project, I had come to learn that my great-grandmother was buried there. And when I came into that information, that knowledge, it had an effect on me. It was like I could feel this in a very deep, visceral way, right? And to the point that I understood why being the CEO of that project, would enable me to care for that family burial site, but also to care for, all of the sites that were deemed important or sacred, culturally to Native Hawaiians. And that was part of the lawsuit as well, right? So I happened to be explaining this to Pua, She paused and she said, Kohoʻia. The word wasn't familiar to me at all, right? Kuleana, we all kind of know, grew up. Because I shared with her the information about my great-grandmother being buried there. And she said, John, as I listen to you talk, you believe you have a decision to make, right? You have this job opportunity. And so on the surface, you believe that you have a choice to make. And Kohoʻia, underneath the surface, the decision has already been made. And basically, you're being called into this work. And when she said that, it's kind of, the feeling I got was like there had been some chiropractic work, right? That all of a sudden, that in sharing that value and that quality kind of aligned my spine better, right? Is what I felt. And then it became the focus, right, was to make that happen. And so I served for 12 years there. In the course of competing for the job at HTA, it was an 8-week competitive process, right? You start with 300 plus, and in 1 month they cut it to 9, 1 week later to 4, 1 week later to 2, 1 week later they make the choice. And when it got down to the final 4, of which I was one, is when that document, that presentation called Mālama Kuʻuhome, right? And there's this iconic shot of Diamond Head with the hotels on the left and the ocean. And I was born and raised 2 blocks from the beach, Waikiki, half block from the zoo, behind what is today the Queen Kapiolani Hotel in that area. But what happened was, in preparing that document and looking at that image, which I had seen 1,000 times before, right? It's used all over the world. What happened for me was the hotels kind of got blurred out. And what I saw were the fishing grounds of our family, because we fished it every week. And when I saw the fishing grounds is when I felt Kohoʻia. That now I understood why I was leading up to that breakthrough. I was competing with kind of my experience and my intellect, right? And as anyone would when you're competing for that opportunity. But once I saw the fishing grounds, the process moved from being cerebral and moved to my gut, right? Then I could see the way in and why, right? Because it came symbolic to me that over the 40 years or plus that I was in the visitor industry, I had grown away from those values that we grew up as kids, right? Where you recognize that Waikiki was a source of food. The elders knew how to prepare certain seaweed, certain limu, and sea urchins for medicinal purposes, right? So, source of food, source of medicine, and then a place of recreation, right? And in the development of Waikiki, recreation became kind of the pinnacle, right? And I realized that as generations move forward, there's a common term that is used called regenerative tourism, right? How do you ensure that the natural world is as vibrant and resilient and healthy, even healthier than it is today, right? And there are actual steps that you can take. But once I recognized that I had grown away from that, it gave deeper meaning to why this work would be important, right? But my point being, when I made that connection with the fishing grounds again, is when I felt Kohoʻia again. And I hadn't felt it since 2001. I remain extremely grateful because it sounds simple on one level, but it is a profound, some people feel called, right, to certain work. But this idea that the responsibility is calling you, I think is profound.
How do you define Kuleana and Kohoʻia? What's the similarities? What's the difference?
Kuleana, I would relate to as the responsibility, right? In the context of it not being a burden, but frankly, a privilege to be able to do the work that is meaningful, right? And so Kuleana, in the context of Kohoʻia, is the voice that is making the call, right?
The Kuleana is the voice?
The Kuleana is the voice. The responsibility is calling, right? And the question for me, am I sensitized enough to hear that voice, right?
And where do you hear the voice?
Inside, right? That point about recognizing that as children and as a family, we fish those waters every week, right? That was custom in our family, okay? And my uncle, who was the master fisherman, right, that I couldn't wait to go with him, right? But as you grow older and you grow away from those patterns that you do as a family, as a community, and we certainly weren't the only fisher people in the neighborhood. When you live in an oceanside community, local people understand, what it takes, right, to exist and be respectful to it as well. So when I made the connection again to Waikiki being a source of food is when I felt at that point I had sensitized myself enough to hear that this particular leadership role in tourism was something that I felt was calling at this particular time, right?
So you talk about Kohoʻia and you talk about the inner voice, right? Where in your body are you hearing that inner voice for Kohoʻia versus just random talk?
When the awareness that I am experiencing Kohoʻia happens is when I felt in each case like there had been chiropractic work done. There's a spinal alignment that I actually feel.
So in your actual spine.
Yeah. And that's how I experience it each time, right? Is that there is this kind of sensation that your backbone and your spine is in alignment now, right? And which then caused me to look back to as far back as I can remember as a child, right? Those days fishing, those days in kindergarten at Jefferson Elementary, right? And all of a sudden, what appeared to be kind of a life of randomness, right, in the work, in my career, and all of a sudden, I could see how it was aligned, right? And maybe it was the transference of what I was experiencing in my spine to just looking at it and say, oh, that's why I did that.
So what are some of those that you're talking about? What are the most meaningful or pivotal?
The earliest I can remember is the days fishing. That would be like 1957, 58, right? I'm 8 years old, 9 years old. And that activity just brings a lot of joy, right? And so it's something to look forward to every Saturday. We're going to do this.
Where would you go fishing? Which part of Waikiki?
So if you walk down Kapahulu Avenue right into the ocean, right, you got the wall there, the break.
The groin.
We'd start on the right side, outside that breakwater wall that you see there. And we'd have nets. There'd be 6 or 7 of us at a time. Basically what you're doing is a hukilau at sea, right? You wrap in the net, and then there's rope with floaters, and about every foot there's a dangling tea leaf. So when you bring the tea leaf rope around, right? So you got a semicircle net. As you pull that rope, that tea leaf, the tea leaf does this in the water, right? So the fish run in the opposite direction into the net. And then we surround the net. As we pull the tea leaf rope, we then begin to close the net, and all the fish are trapped, right? So we'd end up having to go down there and untangle them and bag them. So
you're not using poles, you're just using nets.
You're just using nets out there. And we do that maybe 7, 8 times, right? So we may end up down by the Halekulani by the time, right? And then we jump on the shoreline.
Well, that's kind of far.
That's kind of far.
That's far, carrying everything back.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so we had big rubber tubes, right? Mm-hmm. Throw them, float them. So we'd walk on the sand and drag the...
So we is who? You and your brother and your uncle, or who's we?
Me, my number 2 brother, 2 years younger than me, 2 uncles, 3 cousins, right? Slightly older than me. That activity right there, I hadn't thought about it for a long time, right? And it took me coming back to compete at HTA because I live in Kona, right? So, when you live on the neighbor island and you're competing for something in Honolulu, you automatically feel that the competition is skewed in a way to help people in Honolulu, prevail. Whether that's true or not isn't relevant. If that's what you believe, that's what you believe, right? And that's kind of the attitude, the chip I had on my shoulder, right? I'm in Kona competing for something in Honolulu. But when I saw the fishing grounds, then I realized that I was actually grounded to this place like anybody else, right?
So when you see the photo of the fishing, was the fishing grounds actually in that photo because it was old-time photo?
No,
Okay.
it's a modern-day photo. But for the first time, instead of me looking at Diamond Head or looking at the hotels, it's like all of that fades out and I just see the water, right, where we used to fish.
In your mind's eye, you're looking that way.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm kind of fascinated with this Kohoʻia piece. Is it kind of like voluntold? Like you either volunteer or you get voluntold or no?
It could be. I could see where that would apply. I could see that.
Like if you turned it down, somehow you end up back there again?
Yeah. And part of that orientation to the spine, the backbone, and looking at my life that way in alignment, right? Even though at the time it may have looked like it's a random movement from one career job to the next, right? When you look at it, I realized that the training needed to do the work today had occurred in my life, right? And when all of that starts to sink in, then the sense of claiming that responsibility becomes important. And the thing I like about it too, it's obviously not exclusive to Native Hawaiians, right? Even though the concept may be. But you and I know people, by the commitment, the dedication, the passion they put into their work, you can tell it's not just work, right? That they feel called to it. For me, it was an experience I had roughly 20 years apart, but I'm grateful because part of that spinal alignment sensation is coupled immediately with this overwhelming sense of humility, right? Because for me, I realized there was something bigger happening here.
What was the bigger?
For me, it was recognizing the magnitude of what happens to a society when you're subjected to a global pandemic. And we're having to learn our way through that, right? And then as I began to internalize what economic collapse really means and the number of people that will increasingly become injured from that, either emotionally, financially, spiritually. When I started to understand the magnitude of that is when I became overwhelmed with that sense of humility, but also recognizing that it would take a team effort of team members that I have yet to meet and have yet to meet me, right? And then you go right down the list, right? Governor Ige is trying to figure it out. Libby Char at Department of Health is trying to figure it out. General Hara, and each of the county mayors. So that humility was one sensation that comes to mind. The other one is an immense level of gratitude that got people like that are committed, right? And maybe they don't articulate it as Mālama Kuleana, but their actions demonstrate that, right? And you begin to see that the gift for me in that time frame, again, we're talking about third, fourth quarter, 20, and then 2021. If you were a leader in business, in the community, leaders were on the front line, right? They were not waiting for direction. They were taking steps to protect their neighborhood, protect their family, right? Out of that kind of setback and challenge, we learned a lot, I think, about ourselves. Sadly, as painful and tragic as Lahaina and Maui is, we're going to learn a whole lot.
So what did you learn about yourself?
What I recognized and ultimately embraced was that my learning curve was vertical. And you kind of walk around like like you know how to fix this, right? Or you know how to get through this.
You mean like you can go vertical, or the learning curve was vertical?
The
so
learning
it's
curve was
overwhelming?
vertical.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. That daily, throughout the day, you have to consume new knowledge, right? And implement it, right? In tourism, we couldn't just open the gates and hey, everybody come, right? You sick or not? Not when the hospitals were being overrun and overtaxed and healthcare workers were being pressed, that way. And we had never done it before.
So what did you learn about yourself knowing that the learning curve was vertical?
That I still had the capacity to learn at an accelerated pace. And actually, what's important about that is I never felt that when I was in high school.
Yeah.
There's a rejuvenating effect for me, right?
Or just maybe not the studies.
Not the study.
You can learn vertically in plenty other ways, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, the term I used was grateful, right? I'm full of gratitude because, and you're surrounded by people who are doing the same thing. I talk about General Hara at Haima. He's standing next to somebody who's like battle tested, right? In Baghdad. And I just learned so much by watching him and listening to him, right? But when you're surrounded by people who have goals that are bigger than themselves, it's a real, honor to be able to serve with people like that.
So if you take those 3 years and you can only take one memory or story with you that's meaningful and you couldn't take anything else or remember any of it else, what would it be?
The one thing I would take away that is being in a community like Kauai, okay? And watching volunteers working to provide guidance and assistance to their own people in their own community, right? I have a tendency of endearingly referring to them as like aunties and uncles, right? And earlier I made the point about if you were a leader during that time, you weren't waiting to be invited to the front line. You just moved to the front line, right? And I guess when I think about that collectively on every island, that spontaneous assembly of leaders who knew that we were at risk, who knew that we were under a threat, but it is their nature to protect their family, their kupuna, their neighbor in that way. And so that, for me, I'll never forget what felt to me like an immense power at a time when we needed it.
So from that kind of instance, right, what's a story that you can remember that will be able to kind of express this so people can understand from that perspective?
I just think about the hours that my own staff had to put into. And by that I mean there's the work that they were hired to do, and there's the work that needed to be done. And nobody was saying, well, that's not my job, right? And so when I got to the Tourism Authority in September, the first restrictions were set in March, right? Middle of March. So between March and September, the staff at HTA was already in that formation, and I'm the one that had to catch up. But I was really, frankly, inspired by the way in which they accepted and embraced the challenges that they were having to deal with at that time. And, I just had my final staff meeting at HTA yesterday, and I had a chance to actually thank them in that way because collectively they were already moving in a way that became very instructive and inspirational to me. Mm-hmm. And so, in answer to your question, I think that I would root that to the team at HTA. And frankly, I'm witnessing them being tested on Maui right now as well, right? But I have all the confidence in the world that they will meet their responsibilities and be able to help Maui where Maui wants help, right? And that too is this idea of just kind of exporting solutions from Honolulu to another island is really kind of a thing of the past. Each island is very unique, very proprietary. And so the team at HTA has become very adept at listening, right? And recognizing whether you're being invited into a space and for what purpose. That kind of sensitivity is relatively new, frankly, but it is a way of the future. I just see that if you're going to be successful, you cannot just move into somebody else's island, somebody else is part of the island, right? And say, oh, we're going to fix this. And so Lahaina will prove to be an incredible testing ground in how we collaborate and collectively heal.
Do you see an example of Kohoʻia in Lahaina?
Yes. I haven't had a chance to talk to him yet, but I'm aware of the work he's doing. But there is a Hokulea voyager by the name of Archie Kalepa, well-known ocean man. Hokulani Holt Padilla, who is a kumu hula, highly respected. I haven't been able to talk to her face-to-face yet. But when I look at Archie and I look at Hokulani Kumu, and I've seen them on television spots, I can sense that the work they're doing now, they feel called to do, and they're ready to do it, right? And as such, they just radiate this inspiration that mobilizes people. So, incredible examples of leadership in that area. Another guy is Shep Gordon. Shep is well known in entertainment circles, and I've been in touch with Shep. We've talked to each other maybe on 2 occasions, and has such a deep love for Maui as well that activating his networks who are trying to help financially, and whoever coined the phrase, it takes a village. This is an example of the village going to work.
So from what you've seen going on in Maui, what could the rest of Hawaii or the world learn from that?
I myself physically have not been on the island, right? Limited staff, because the last thing you also need is go charging into an island, right? And that's the whole point about listening and being invited into it. But, I think recognizing that the impact, the adverse impact, the tragedy, if you will, is related to somebody who lost a loved one, is experiencing it at a very intense level. Somebody who lost their home, their business, their job, right? So I think it's important that we recognize how personal this experience is, and getting through the grief and moving toward a time of healing is going to be at a very personal rate, right? It's not going to be kind of a uniform, one day everybody's okay. I think what we have to learn from the people of Maui is how the people of Maui are helping the people of Maui, right? And how certain neighborhoods just open their doors, right? I mean, when you have one home that is hosting more than 50 family members, and when you've got neighborhoods that have self-converted themselves into relief centers, right? It's indicative. I think we saw glimpses of that in Hurricane Eva, Hurricane Iniki. We're seeing it again. It is, for Kama'aina in particular, it's not even a question as to whether you should be doing this, right? It is kind of the way many people were raised. And so the response is somewhat automatic, right? I can remember Hurricane Iniki. I was working on a project out on the south end. We couldn't go onto the island for like 5 days after the hurricane hit. And then when they allowed people to go back in, I decided to go over, and it was a resort project. We're probably about 8 months away from opening and completing the construction. Obviously, the hurricane set all of that back, right? And so I went over with 2 other executives on our team, and much to their dismay, took them back to the airport, and they said, "Aren't you going back with us?" I said, "No." "Well, you got to be crazy to stay on the island, and there's nothing." And I had 2 bottles of water and change of clothes, and I left them at the airport. I went through Lihue, and I went through Kapa'a, and I could see the big Red Cross tents, FEMA, the big lines, right? And everybody lined up to get their blankets and food and water, and it was well executed. But as I started to move out into the more rural areas, like Anahola and Hawaiian homes, I saw something really different. I saw kids husking coconuts and stacking the coconut, like you would a case of, juice. They must have had 50 like husked coconuts all stacked up. And then you go deeper and you see the hunters coming back with, deer and pigs. And I went further to the south end where I had some friends, and I go in the backyard, and it was the largest collection of lobster I had seen. The lesson was that the people who know how to live off the land actually flourish during those kinds of, right? And that's something, too, that we need to learn. And it's their nature to want to share it, too, right? So that night, the steak and lobster dinner, that was as good as anything you would get in Waikiki, right? And you hear a lot about this, right, of people living off the aina, people concerned about what's happening to the aina, right? The source of water, all of that, wildlife. And it's because when times are tough and you need to call on that, there are people who know how to do it. So, yeah, the lessons that we will learn will be multiple, but this idea of people helping one another, I think, is... And the sadness of even the evacuation of people grabbing elders, trying to get them out of Lahaina. Some of them making it, some of them not, right?
You have family in Lahaina?
I don't. I have family in Wailuku. And between 1988 and 93, I lived in Lahaina. We were developing the Embassy Suites Hotel, which we opened in 1989. And we were developing another one at Wailea, the Kealani. So I was on the island for about 5.5 years during that period. Like everyone else, even watching the devastation was really tough, too, right? And the sadness. And, having a background in the hospitality industry, hotel industry, a high percentage of families of Filipino ancestry, right, that go back to the plantation days and multi-generational in the same home, working hard, saving money to bring more family, right? And so every time they identify names of those who passed, sadly, a high percentage of them are Filipino ancestry, right? And that's a big part of Lahaina's history as well.
And for the HTA piece, do you feel like you still have Kohoʻia for that or no?
No. I think that the succeeding leadership team there is, with the exception of one, is kind of next generation type, right? Mm-hmm. I signed a 3-year contract. That 3 years is up tomorrow. The board had given me the opportunity to extend for 1 year, and I chose not to. But part of that choice was recognizing that the succeeding leadership team has what it takes to get through this. Yeah. It's been a tough 3 years. It's been both challenging and invigorating at the same time. But I'm also anxious to take some time out and sensitize myself again to, what is it now? So in leaving HTA, I'll miss the people. I'll know where to find them when I miss them too much. But I'm not sad beyond that, right? Because I actually believe they've got the ability to do it. And I'm very proud of them, actually. Daniel Naho'opi'i will be the acting president. I expect that the board will keep him in place until they get through the next legislative session. Daniel actually had a previous stint as the head of research at HTA. So his operating knowledge of HTA and institutional knowledge exceeds my own level of understanding. When I hired him in January to come back to HTA, part of me sensed that his leadership trajectory was just beginning. So, yeah, going back to your question about whether I feel Kohoʻia or not relative to HTA, there was a moment in time that the pandemic produced that different kind of attention, and that's what I felt called to, right?
So like your tour of duty is done?
Yeah, in that phase of it, right? And now what is the next question, and it's not like I'm going around going like, now what, now what? It really has more to do with taking some downtime, spending it with my wife. The one thing we can rule out is retirement.
Why?
It's not my nature, and part of it is I actually am invigorated by work, right? The challenge of doing it. And so it's not the idea of going and playing golf 3 or 4 times a week and doesn't appeal to me. I mentioned earlier, I think there's no shortage of needs in Hawaii, right?
So you don't want my uncle's schedule?
Who, by the way, looks a lot better. I saw
like
him
his
a couple
schedule?
weeks ago, and your uncle called me to inject some level of humor or intellect or something.
He has intellect.
Huh? Does he have intellect? Actually, he does.
Yeah, he has intellect. I was just messing with him.
That's why he's a doctor, right? Or a PhD. That's funny you say that. But, yeah, the majority of my classmates have retired, and I'm glad to see that. But I think part of it is I didn't have children of my own, okay? When I married my wife, she had 3 children, but they were all adults. And so I think the absence of this paternal clock, right? Like, gotta take my child to school, or my child graduating, or my child going away. All of that has been kind of not part of my pattern, right? And so there may be a distortion of time and what I should be doing at age 72 or not doing, right? I feel healthy enough to remain active. And I think it is part of a health regimen is to stay challenged by, and being pushed like that, even now. I mean, a lot to be grateful for.
Can I ask you on the Auntie Pua, right? Did she have any other times with you, like the Kohoʻia piece, that really kind of shifted your perspective or your life?
She is very steeped and knowledgeable about ancient chants. And over the years, I've had conversations about certain insights that one derives from chants, right? And so, in particular, there's a chant of creation called the Kumulipo. And she is well-versed in that. She's been able to inspire next generation students who are now teachers themselves to study and test and reimagine what is contained in chants like that, right? I think there's 2,106 lines in the Kumulipo, and it's broken down or segmented into verses, right? In verse number 13, I learned from her that there are 3 houses of ancestral knowledge: the house of knowledge of the cosmos, the house of knowledge of the planet Earth, and the house of knowledge of all living systems and life forms, right? That Hawaiians of old broke it out that way, right? And all 3 of them are interconnected, right? It's been intriguing to me to be around her when she is either lecturing or sharing, because one of the things I experience with her is sometimes it's a breakthrough for her too, right? You may have looked at that chant 100 times before, but on this particular occasion, there's a different kind of reflection. And so, in presentations I've done in tourism, I haven't hesitated to use her work as an example of how deep the authenticity of Hawaiian knowledge, indigenous wisdom goes, right? In fact, the last staff meeting yesterday at HTA, Maui is the focus right there with. So there's a legend about the demigod Maui lassoing the sun to slow the sun down because the days were too short in his mother's kapa. So I had images of this, but people relate to that chant or that legend, that story. But I had this image of the sun and the Earth's rotation around the sun. The sun is not centered in that rotation. It is actually off-centered, right? So if you dissected this into half of the rotation of the Earth is a smaller arc and the other one is a larger one. Yet, they both take exactly the same amount of time. Okay. And another elder told me, John, that's what the Maui legend is about, is that on the shorter arc, which should be completed faster, the Maui legend is about Maui causing the sun to slow down on that half, right? So that it's perfectly aligned with the larger. Okay. That kind of convergence of indigenous stories and native legends have a tendency of becoming almost fairy tale-like, right? Until you actually merge it with the science of the time. I mean, to understand that kind of thing, you would have to observe, right, constantly. So when I'm around Hawaiian elders who have that kind of depth and insight, right, and certainly Antipua is one of them. Hokulani Holt, I mentioned earlier on Maui. These people have dedicated their lives. Hula is a way of life, right? Not just the insights that they bring, especially when we're moving into a time where climate science is becoming so important, right? When you stop to think about the fact that Hawaiians had more than 300 names for rain and more than 400 names for clouds, that would suggest that they had a very intimate knowledge of that, right? I often joke about the fact that if you're a weatherman back in the days of old and you said, oh, tomorrow going to be partly cloudy, you'd be laughed out of the village, right? It's you would need to demonstrate a level of precision about what you're talking about, as opposed to this kind of partly cloudy thing, right? When I think about the island of Hawaii, and I think about astronomy on Mauna Kea, and I think about anybody that is in climate science around the world is taking baseline measurements off of a station on Mauna Loa. And when I think about that kind of thing, and then merging that modern science and technology with this information that is embedded in things like the chant, the language, right? Place names. The opportunity for some really interesting breakthroughs, I think, are really part of what I think is exciting about Hawaii's future. And so to the point about being in the presence of people like Puakanahele is that kind of awareness, that kind of knowledge, that kind of understanding of language, traditional practices, why they were done, the precision with which they were done. This notion, the slang has been Hawaiian time has become synonymous with no matter, or come late, right? And yet quite the opposite is true. I mean, the Hawaiians of old, like many people who had agrarian lifestyles, right, had to be extremely precise. The rituals had to be precise. Your understanding of time had to be very precise because the protocol that you needed to perform at sunrise couldn't be 15 minutes after sunrise, right, waiting for everybody to get there. And it's that kind of precision when I'm around people like Antipua. They're not going to settle for anything less. That is how the halau functions, right? When I relate these kinds of stories to what the future of a visitor experience can be, right? We, as the host, can choose what it is we want to share, right? And at some point, we've tired of sharing superficial experiences, but the depth, the repository of information and knowledge that is the culture of old Hawaii. And then when you overlay it with the multicultural customs and traditions that have made our island society what it is, there's a richness about this that frankly the world actually needs right now. And certainly I think America as a nation, as we're watching kind of the fragmentation politically, and, Hawaii has no need or no reason to pattern itself after that. That in many ways we have elevated ourselves. Well, I'm not suggesting we're perfect in any way, but we have found a way to coexist. And one would hope that we hold on to that quality that may end up differentiating Hawaii from a lot of other places, on the planet.
When have you felt Kohoʻia as a child?
I didn't understand it as a child because my introduction to it comes in 2001, right? And comes again in 2020.
So you become aware of it and
Yeah.
kind of you notice it at that point. But now looking back,
When I look back at it, I very much wanted to go to Kamehameha. My mother was an alumnus, class of 49. So from the time I was like 5 years old, at the old Honolulu Stadium, I would watch the Kamehameha football team take the field, and I aspired to want to do that. And then in the 8th grade, when I got rejected, like many other Hawaiians, I ended up at Punahou.
how did that work?
One of the great gifts in my life, first of all. But in the 8th grade, 13 years old, my heart's at Kamehameha. I'm physically at Punahou. And I'm in culture shock, right? I can remember being somewhat embarrassed by the family car and asking my father to drop me off a couple blocks from school, right? That quickly changed because then my father became a car salesman, so he constantly had new cars. Right. And I didn't want to walk a couple blocks to school. So anyway, when I began to understand Kohoʻia, I think of my education of Punahou as in that context too now. It put me into a place where I was not comfortable, but I had to figure it out, right? Certainly not the only local kid that went through, you're at that stage in your life where you're dealing with a lot of different things, right? Suffice it to say, I would have been more comfortable at Kamehameha. But the real gift of not being comfortable at age 13 is you've got to learn how to stretch, right? And so for me, at Punahou, the football team, the athletic teams, football and basketball in my case, became kind of my tribe, right? We were comfortable together. And then eventually, end of year 2, year 3, you kind of worked it through, right? The thing that makes me relate to it now, and frankly, I've never thought of it until you asked the question, but when I think about the accelerated growth during the 5 years I was at Punahou, I can see the importance of me having had that experience at that stage of my life, not only for me, but for my entire family. Because my family, I was the oldest of 4 boys and 1 girl. 16 years between me and the girl. So my senior year at Punahou, she's 2 years old, right? So all the cheerleaders and song leaders, they can't wait to go get her and hold her. And I have memories about that. But what happens is when you're in a school that is that steeped in tradition, the family becomes a big part of it, as you know, right? And it became a very enriching experience for my family that grew out of the culture shock or the sense that maybe we didn't belong, right? Until you started connecting with other families, like Henry Kapono's family, and, very well steeped in you're talking about a family of pure Hawaiians, right? And Dave Eldridge was another factors. So I started to look for other Hawaiians that looked comfortable there. And a couple of them were my coaches, right? Charlie Aune, Dave Eldridge, Mercer Vicens, Buddy Suarez. So these people became kind of mentors. But when I look back at it, the value has to do with learning the academic freedom and the freedom to think and freedom to think differently are things that I value when I look back at that. But I can see that helped prepare me for that 2001 assignment, right? Because I dropped out of UH after 3 semesters, right? I joke about it because my father was selling cars. I tell people when I left, I had more parking tickets than credits. Okay? Because my father was bringing cars home from the docks that I knew were not registered. So I knew that the UH campus security were tagging cars that didn't exist. Okay, so I had this wad of tickets that, and my father's, why I kept all the tickets, I'll never know. And David Lasner, the current president at UH, and I have a laugh over the fact that he may still want to collect on those tickets. And it'd be an exorbitant amount of interest right now. So I dropped out and I went to work for our neighbor who owned a construction company. And leading up to that time, like from the time I was 14, we would work on weekends and vacations for cash, right? He built swimming pools and waterfalls, exterior kind of work, right? So when I dropped out of UH, my father was terribly disappointed. He was a good-sized Hawaiian man who in 1970 could have handled his disappointment in multiple ways, right? And instead he resorted to his wit. And he said to me, upon hearing that I had dropped out, "You would make a great astronaut because right now in this home, you're taking up space." I got his message, and so within a week I had a job, right, with my neighbor. And so between 14 and 20 years old, 19, 20, I actually became a foreman, a superintendent. Right? So I could take a team of 4 or 5 construction crew members and go build a pool from start to finish, right? And being that as it may, the company ended up getting contracted to build 2 swimming pools at the Coco Palms Hotel on Kauai. And a condition of the contract that was imposed by the legendary general manager, her name was Grace Guslander. And a condition of the contract was that the crew had to be all Native Hawaiian. And so I was the only superintendent in the company that was Hawaiian. A lot of great crew members that were Hawaiian. So anyway, the boss, who was not Hawaiian, came from Arkansas, said, "You got to go head this crew and go get this thing built," right? So we did. And my younger brother, 2 years younger than me, was on that crew. What I learned, keep in mind, this is 1971, so I'm 20 years old. What I realized was that Coco Palms is located in Wailua. And Wailua was the royal residence of the last king and queen of Kauai and all the chiefs that preceded them on that island. So a very sacred, iconic spot, that whole valley. And I came to appreciate the fact that the reason the general manager and owner of the hotel, Grace Guslander, wanted an all-Hawaiian crew is she sensed that as you excavate in that area, we would find iwi, kupuna, burials, or artifacts. And that Hawaiians would do one of 2 things. Out of fear, we would stop. Out of respect, we would stop, right? But we would stop. And sure enough, we encountered burial remains. And in the course of that, we were building the swimming pools next to 2 brand new wing buildings, 4-story buildings. 3-story buildings. And they were coming out of the ground, and we were building the 2 swimming pools that would front the building. And the contractor who was doing the building had an electrical violation. The county stopped the project, so all construction stopped. The boss says, "Send the crew home, but you gotta stay to deal with any inspections." Right. So every night, Mrs. Guslander would have a cocktail party. Every night. 7 nights a week. And she would invite me because she knew I was on the island. And that became my first introduction into tourism. And what I realized watching these tour directors and wearing white pants, white shoes, Aloha shirt, tour group following them off a bus, and me on a good day is covered with concrete, covered with mud. My fingernails are dirty. I thought, God, I would like to do this kind of work. Now, without me knowing, the general manager went to my boss and said, I want to invite John to join our company, and I want to put him into a management training program. And the boss never told me anything, but Mrs. G, as she was known, called me into her office, made me this offer. I thanked her, but I said no. I'm 21 years old. I didn't want to live on Kauai. But I came back and applied for a job as a tour director with the company that I had seen coming through. And it was a company that she and her husband had founded called Island Holidays that eventually was acquired by AmFact. So, you're picking up a tour group, and depending on the package, you're with them for a week, 10 days, 2 weeks. Depending again on the package, you're doing one island, 2 islands, right? So I did that. I eventually ran that department. But when you're operating at that level, you develop a real granular understanding of the visitor journey and the experience that they're having, right? So you're living with them. You meet them at the airport. You're in baggage claim with them. You get them to the hotel. And so every segment of their experience is being basically woven together by you as the tour director, right? So that became kind of an introduction. Oddly enough, even my time at HTA, that experience back then is still applicable, right? Modified in many ways, but we certainly didn't have security back then that you got to go through. I remember leaving Waikiki late, and I could call the airport and tell them hold the jet, right? Because we had every seat in it, right? Today we're running late, we'll be there, and we could fill nightclubs. We had this bulk purchasing power that we could utilize. And then I went and I got reassigned and moved to Chicago and Dallas for 2 years to focus on kind of the different markets that serve Hawaii, right? I wasn't thrilled about being assigned on the mainland, but a good friend of mine took over the company. I said, why are you sending me to the mainland? I got this town wired, right? Waikiki wired. He said, that's the problem. You got it wired and you got to go learn something else. So he basically forced me out, and I made him buy me 3 suits. And I lived in the Chicago O'Hare Hotel, today the Hyatt Hotel at the DFW airport, right? Every week I went to a trade show somewhere. So that became an accelerated kind of learning about the market, the U.S. market in particular. And this started out as a story about Punahou, right? But the common thread is that in every case, whether it was building swimming pools, being a tour director, being in sales for a hotel company, I had a certain comfort level of being thrown into situations where I was in above my head. Being in above my head didn't freak me out.
And you attribute that to Punahou?
I do. Because that's one of my early experiences in initially feeling inadequate. I don't have what it takes to be here, right? And then eventually learning that I can belong here, right? And you're the only one that's walking around with this sense of insecurity, right? You got people around here who want to help you. You got friends. And again, at age 13, when you're dealing with all kinds of growth issues, and then you got one more like this thrown on, it's like, what? No kamehameha. What? No. So, yeah, during that time, when I was running that department, escorted tour department, you had like a United Airlines strike. You had a DC-10 grounding. And so half the air seats that service Hawaii are gone, right? And now you got to scramble and you got to make it work, right? And so this idea of being thrown into a situation that really requires situational leadership, right? I actually attribute to Punahou. and this inherent fear I had of public speaking. I would freeze in speech class. And then in tourism, that's kind of all you do, right? So getting through that, and I'm glad we're talking about it because I can appreciate the Puno experience in that context today.
I heard you tell that story from your grandmother before about Hawaii. Can you share that one again?
About the glass of water.
And maybe even like when the circumstance around that a little bit.
There's a place called Kahaluu Bay. It used to be the Keoho Beach Hotel. And on the north side of the hotel, so as you're looking at the ocean, it'll be on the right side of the hotel. There was a replica of a King Kalakaua beach cottage where they had certain cultural displays, and it was a model of what architecture of that time would look like, right? And the guy who designed it was Herb Conade, the artist, historian. And Island Holidays, the company I worked for, owned that hotel at the time. Actually, Grace Guslander's husband, Lyle Guslander, built the hotel. At various stages of my career, I had spent a lot of time at that place. It became my favorite hotel, actually. And even after I left Island Holidays and they sold the hotel, I did some consulting work for different ownership groups because my knowledge of the hotel ran pretty deep. And so there was a time when I was temporarily working in a back room in that beach cottage, okay? There's a back stairway and there was nothing on display, so it was a big enough room for me to actually have an office back there. So I'm sitting there one day and there's this half glass of water and I'm looking at the water, I'm looking at the glass, and I can hear my grandmother, I can hear her voice. She's talking about the water. First was, whether it's half full or half empty is the wrong question. The glass has always been 100% filled, half with the air we breathe, half with the water we drink, and 100% of it is filled with light. And until you learn how to value that which is intangible, the same way you value the things that are tangible, you will just keep repeating the same lessons in life, right? And that part, which is the air we breathe, our ancestors referred to as Ha, the breath of life. That part which we drink, via fresh water, via the fresh waters of life. And E is in reference to the spiritual dimension represented by the light. So in this metaphor is the very identity of who we are as people, as a place, and as a society. I was just like fascinated by that whole explanation and the simplicity of it, and looking at the glass of water, hearing that voice, right? What I typically don't share is that she had passed away roughly 6 months before that. When I tell the story to people in my family, to my cousins, to whom she was grandma as well, they can relate to it. They can relate to it. They can understand why. Nobody ever heard it, right? But they could understand why that would be the kind of wisdom she would impart. And the people in my family know that at the time I was born, that grandmother from Kona was living here in Kaka'ako. And in order for my mom to go back to work, she would drop me off at my grandmother's home in Kaka'ako, right? So grandma had me from the time I was probably a month old until I went to kindergarten every weekday, right? So you can imagine the impact that she had on my formative years, right? And I just happened to be in that age where she was able to do that and my mother was able to return to the workplace. So the relationship I had with that grandmother, my maternal grandmother, both grandmothers were very close, but the maternal grandmother had a big impact. And so when I tell that story to people in the family, they kind of all like shrug their shoulders, right? Because they just kind of know that she and I had that kind of relationship because of those early years and throughout. And, you know, you can line up every grandchild, every great-grandchild, and every one of them will speak endearingly about her. She just had this, not very big, not very tall, but nobody questioned her. And immensely wise, right? I'm not sure she ever finished grade school. But, you know, I can remember when she was born and raised in Kawaloa, which is the northern bank of Kealakekua Bay, okay? And she would have to walk up to Kainaleo to Konowaina School, which is a trek uphill, okay? But I can remember walking through, like, high grasses and stuff like that. And I'd get to the opposite end, and I'd be covered with, like, stickers and stuff like that. And I'd look at her, and there'd be like nothing on her, you know. And I came to appreciate the fact that she was so comfortable in this natural environment that she knew how to step on rocks. She knew how to walk, right? And one of the things I recall about her, too, is right outside her kitchen door, there would be like medicinal plants. So if one of the grandchildren had some kind of ache or pain, she would kind of know. It was like now I think about it, it's like a pharmacy, right? So when I think
medicinal plants.
What's that?
Like pakalolo kind medicinal plant?
No. Stuff like olena. Olena is kind of a root that
Turmeric.
you use for earache, right? It draws that out. She also would use like the koale tree, Koali, koale. I can remember even as an adult having a sprained ankle. Actually, it was like right out of Punoa, sprained ankle. And she knew that in Waimanalo had koale. This is before my wife and I were married, but she'd go with my wife. And my grandmother looked really Caucasian, haole, right? And my wife is from Iowa. So here are these two women driving around Waimanalo looking for this certain bark, right? But my grandmother was also bilingual. She could speak in Hawaiian. So anyway, come home, strip the bark, wrap the bark around my ankle, and the next day the swelling would be gone, right? So that kind of like attunement to the natural world, prayer before every application, right? When you think about prayer in kind of a religious context and you look at it as being intentional, right? Actually, Kohoʻia may actually go back to her. You know, we started out with Kohoʻia, and now as I go back and think about the times with her, times alone with her, times I disappointed her. I mean, when I think about Kohoʻia in that sense, and things like hearing grandma's voice, right? And fixated on the glass of water and hearing her impart that lesson. And, you know, I've told that story. I don't talk about her being passed away. Not everybody ready for that, for one thing. And I'm not trying to sensationalize it either, right? But I've told that story a lot, even when I was at HTA. People will come up to me and say, do you mind if I tell that story? And I'll credit you. And I go, you know, the story doesn't belong to me. My grandmother wanted me to know this is much more universal than that. So I don't feel, you don't need my permission. If you're moved by it and you're inspired by it, then by all means use it. Because that kind of wisdom isn't owned.
So when have you ever had that type of ancestral knowledge come through you other than that?
I think we talked about the recognition of the fishing ground again, right? Yeah, that ancestral tradition and knowledge, and then modern world growing away from it, right? And then having it come back into your life at age 69. And then you remember, I mean, hey, we're holding on to this rope, right? And every foot get one tea leaf hanging. How technologically advanced is that? Until you actually pull it through the water and these leaves are dancing like this, right? And you're underneath with your goggles and you're watching the fish just doing 180 back into the net. Those kinds of experiences that embed all this information and knowledge, right? It's like when COVID in 2020, August of 2020, there was a news story about baby hammerhead sharks being seen along the shoreline in Waikiki. When I heard that story, I knew that, March through August, so you're roughly 5.5 months of no intense swimming, human traffic in Waikiki, okay? And now the news story is hammerhead sharks are back. The reason that resonated with me so strongly is that hammerhead sharks would all the time get tangled in our nets. So we would have to untangle them and let them go. Now, the fact that they were being seen in August, right, meant a couple things to me. That the limu that they would normally feed on is growing again. That's bringing them back. And because this is subterranean water, right, fresh water flowing, that's where Waikiki gets its name, right? Spouting fresh water, bubbling fresh water. That's why you got so many different temperatures along that shoreline, is where the underground water is entering the ocean is cooler, right? So when I heard the story about that day, I immediately thought that a certain limu got to be back, that's brought them back in, the temperatures brought them back in. It doesn't have all this human interference, right? It just made me think about what that level of connection with kind of your own natural environment is, and how important it is for us not to lose that when you live on an island, right? And it is about like relearning how to live on an island, kind of what we're going through here. But for me, that brought back the stories of it. And so when I think about, now that we're talking about my grandmother in that context, and my paternal grandmother was as loving as the other grandmother. So, my siblings benefited from growing up at a time when our grandparents had big impact on us. And, concurrently, your parents are out there working their butts off, trying to make a living. And so the interaction with them is different, right? Sporting events, dinner. My parents were intent on having dinner at the table. We just make our plate and go watch TV, right? Forget it, right? Everybody had to be at the table. When I think about that, how important that is, that time with the family, and then having, both sets of grandparents influence us the way they did, I guess, that the sensitivity of recognizing Kohoʻia, it comes out of that kind of nurturing, I think, too, for me. And other people will get there in their own ways, right? And it's not like they were pushovers either. I mean, they were tough. They were old school. But at no time did I ever feel that they were not loving.
So you remember when I invited you back onto the show, right? And then you asked me, why me? Right? Why did you ask me that?
I was more curious about whether this was an update of the previous conversation we had, whether it was tourism related, right? And then your response to me actually caused me to think about the fact that somebody kind of broke the code, kind of knew that in a secular way that I was trying to invoke teachings that had come out of my own genealogy, my own ancestral, that somebody recognized that there are aspects of the work that you're doing and advocating that have that vibrational frequency, right? And so it caused me to stop and pause. Frankly, I appreciated the response. It made me more eager to be here, because it's a rare opportunity, especially in the last 3 years, where you're trying to make a news cycle, or that the reporter, no matter how well intentioned, cannot possibly grasp all of it, right? Mm-hmm. And so they try their best, and the professionals do it well, but it's still, so given the opportunity to talk story about it and flow with it, right? It's therapeutic for me. And today has produced some new insights for me that especially now that I'm going in tomorrow to turn in my credentials. And, it's kind of like I feel a sense of more complete, right? That it is time to move on, rejuvenate, and relax, and try and understand what the next season of work will be, right?
So I think if people are kind of tuning into this, they're not going to know what I'm actually talking about. So when I texted you, can you want to come back on? And then you wrote back, it said, like, why me? And then when it came back late at night, I was like, oh, crap. What does this mean? Like, part of me in my head going, oh, no, because that was right also along the time that you said you're not going to re-up at HTA, right? So in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, maybe he's thinking I'm going to try to, like, get the scoops on something or, you know what I mean? Like, is this part of the news thing or whatever? And I answered it super transparent, which was something along the lines of, I can see an ancestral energy coming through you that you're trying to express in this way. And that's what I want to talk about. And then I sent it. I remember just before I was going to send, I was like, I don't know. But I sent it. And then afterwards I was thinking, because you never respond for a couple of days, I was like, I told my wife, I said, oh, bro, I think I might have scared him. But hey, that's just what was for real. And then you responded and he said, okay, yeah.
Yeah, actually, the delay in the response had more to do with shaking out the schedule, right? Because the transfer of leadership authority at HTA has already been completed. So Daniel Nahopi has been in control since before Maui happened. Okay, and I've been there to support it. It really had more to do with me offloading certain assignments, responsibilities. Because my other concern is, when thinking about your request, is if I let too much time go by, that my tendency will be, I just like stop talking, right? And then when you told me that this is not going beyond until after I leave HTA, right? So that I'm trying to put some space between me and the new leadership, right? Like I've been invited
this might be
to
2024 kind of.
Yeah, I'm kind of invited to speak at conferences, and I'm turning them down because or referring them, right? Because you do want to hear from the voices of the ones that are going to carry it forward, okay? And it's really interesting because at my final staff meeting yesterday, I've got 24 on my staff, and they gave me this large greeting card, farewell card, and they all wrote a note in there, right? And I'm certainly glad I didn't read it at the meeting, because I would have broke down emotionally. Because it's so moving to hear from people and understand that the impact that I had on them, right? And conversely, the impact they're having on me, right? And it's especially when you've been through a tough period, right? Coming out of COVID. And then now me watching them go through kind of a Maui recovery, right? And the pain, the loss of life, what that does to, one's psyche, whether you related or not related. Part of our caution to the team for the last month has been, be cognizant, be aware of how much media on this topic your children are taking in. They're going to have a difficult time separating that, right? And so being able to just talk about that kind of stuff in that way, right? I'm extremely grateful because it's right there, and the things we have talked about here really kind of have a bearing on me being able to walk out the door one last time tomorrow, knowing that I did the best I could, that I was assigned to do. Public servants don't get enough gratitude, I think, sometimes. I never aspired to be an elected official or work for government, but this one was a different assignment. And the other people I'm grateful to is the board. By design, that board at HTA is meant to be diverse in its representation between industry, community, culture, right? And it's a 12-member board, and in the 3 years I've been there, 10 members have cycled out, okay? A total of 22, Mufi Hanneman being the latest arrival. So people who serve at that level that need to create policy and set the direction and do it in a civil manner, knowing that the person across the table from you in the boardroom may see it completely different, right? So I was really fortunate to have worked with the people I've worked with. And so I take all of that for the experience of running a state authority is one that I really value. We have a tendency of wanting to make government function more like private business. And I've come to appreciate the fact that that's not the nature of a bureaucracy that's dealing with public funding, public monies, right? It gets scrutinized, re-scrutinized, layer after layer after layer, but it is there to ultimately protect the public trust. And so learning that in contrast to working in the private sector has been a real gift as well. And hats off to elected officials, because it takes a lot of courage to enter your name to go compete in an election, right? And whether you agree with their principles or policies is secondary to, I think, being respectful of the fact that they had to exude a level of courage just to throw their hat in the ring. So much of that was part of kind of the vertical learning curve we were talking about earlier, right?
The Kohoʻia piece, which is like a calling, almost like voluntold, where it's like, too bad, so sad. This is where you're going, and hopefully you embrace it. And this is something I had heard from your talks as well as the other podcasts that you had done with Unyang, and it was a theme, right? So as I'm listening to that and then listening to the stories, I'm like, that's where I said, there's something moving through here that is catching my eye or my ear or so on. And then when you said that the way you noticed it is the vertical alignment of your spine, and then you noticed the fish pond in your mind's eye in that picture, right? So what was popping into my mind is that the vertical alignment was when your na'au, your heart and your mind, your spirit align in one, and you felt it in the spine. And the picture piece of Waikiki was time to come home.
Yeah.
Time for you to come home. And then the energetic, like fuel, gas, so on under it is the ancestral push. The ancestral energy that comes through that says, John, now's the time, right? You aligning this way, na'au, heart and mind in your place where you were raised in this time where it's kind of clean slate because no more tourists.
You know, interesting you relate to it that way. Some traditions talk about chakras, right?
Okay.
That kind of alignment. I'm not that familiar enough to know what that means, but I think the alignment of the heart and mind
And
of the na'au feels right? The late Dr. Earl Bakken, he's the co-inventor of the pacemaker, right? Medtronics out of Minneapolis. And passed away a couple of years ago. I got to know Earl fairly well, and we served on board together. But, you know, he was the first one that talked to me about the fact that our memory is stored in our intestines. And this is why we have people talk about gut feeling, right? I thought about this, but my gut feeling was, you know, and to differentiate between kind of thinking about it and knowing. And so I don't go around daily thinking about my ancestors, right? But I am very much aware that I am kind of the outer extension of them, right? Part of that awakening to the fishing grounds, the reawakening, right, is that it brought back just the joy of the activity, okay? But it also brought back a greater awareness of that when you're on an island, your food supply is important, right? And your access to medicinal remedies is important. So in that sense, that kind of ancestral teaching that comes out of my family, I can only speak to it coming out of my family. And what I remember, right, being with a grandmother, wrapping my ankle in a bark. And more than that, it actually worked. The next morning, the swelling was gone, right? And the pain was gone. This idea of coming home, I think, is a very powerful one because beyond just the geographical definition of home is what is that place inside of me that is home, right? And when I think of it in that context, that grandmother, my maternal grandmother, would always say, you could line up all the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and they're going to say, what did grandma say all the time? And you could do a blind survey, and they would say, clean your own house first. You're not here to tell other people that they got to clean their house. Clean your own house first, right? So when I think of it, this idea of coming home, home being within, basically clean my own stuff, right? And perhaps the sloppy way of describing that, I need time off, right? I just need time to rejuvenate. But really, it's a time to be more mindful, more introspective, more forgiving, too, of whatever mistakes may have been made, whatever. The Hawaiians talk about ho'oponopono, right? And every, Thanksgiving, Christmas, my grandfather would, tell the family, you got a ho'oponopono, right? Carry all that stuff into the next year. Start now. About Thanksgiving, he would start, every time you saw him. I can see the value of that when I look at the relationship. I've lost 2 younger brothers, so I have 1 younger brother and 1 younger sister, and I look at the relationship we have with each other, having grown up in that way. And it's a beautiful thing. I thought about it the other night, where one's on an Alaskan cruise and one is on our way home from vacationing in San Diego. And the 3 of us are exchanging photos. But when you're at this point in your life and you're that comfortable with your siblings where you make it a point before you go to bed to tell them that you love them, I realized the other night before last, that how special that is to be told by your brother that he loves you, right? And how important it is that we never lose that connection, but it's part of that practice or that way is an ancestral teaching into itself about keeping the relationships clean, vibrant. And so in that sense, I think this notion or this premise of coming home, coming full circle, right, will help me when I do step down tomorrow and prepare for the next phase and whatever that will be. But before you grab the next thing, you do have to go clean. You naturally accrue all these energy fields, right? Especially when you're in a high-profile position, you're not even aware about how much psychic energy you're taking in, right? And especially during a time of social media where people can talk without being accountable, right? And it becomes tantamount to drive-by, right? Shooting, of energy, right? I'm really grateful to you for raising it, for framing it that way, because that enables me to understand the continuum, right, that we're in, that there is no beginning or end. There is a continuum here. And so the resetting of the spine and realigning that is especially important because 2 nights ago, I have this dream and I'm in a football game and there's a fumble and I reach out to go recover the fumble and I end up punching with my fingertips the headboard on my bed, right? Which then sent this kink in my back, right? It was with such a force that I got that, and it took me a day and a half to get rid of it, right? It's like this, and the fact that we're talking about it now makes me think about that because I could feel that lack of alignment. I had to leave to come to Honolulu, so I couldn't go to my chiropractor. But yeah, this idea about coming home, I think I will take as a real takeaway here because that is kind of the experience, right, of doing it. That is what the fishing grounds look like. That is what Punahou, has meant to me. It is a place that I feel at home at, right? I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, so maybe all of that external stuff is a reminder for you on where to look for where is home.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah. So I just want to send you some appreciation for coming on the show, spending time again with me after almost, 14 years or something? It's been a while. For all that you do and all the aloha and mana'o that you share with others. Appreciate you.
Thank you. This has been an unanticipated, unexpected, beautiful surprise. And I appreciate everything you do to move it at these depths, right? And because we're at the point now where the search for meaning is really important, right? And therein lies a greater sense, a deeper sense of purpose. And yeah. But no, looking forward to returning home. All right.
If you resonate with Greater Good Radio, please join our community at www.greatergoodradio.com, where you can get access to exclusive content and offerings. Hope to see you soon.